Imagine you are one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. You have signed paperwork that sent hundreds of thousands of people to their deaths. You have sat in the same room as Hitler, as Himmler, as every monster the Third Reich ever produced. You know where every body is buried because you helped bury most of them. And then the war starts going wrong. And you look around the room and you realize everyone in this room is going to hang. Everyone except you, because you already picked up the phone and called the enemy. That man was Karl Wolff, Heinrich Himmler's closest aide. The man who ran the SS from the inside for over a decade. And somehow, he died peacefully in Bavaria at 84 years old, while 300,000 of his victims never came home. This is how he did it. Karl Wolff was not born into evil. That is the first thing you need to understand about him, because it makes his story so much more disturbing than if he had been. He was born in 1900 in Darmstadt, into a perfectly normal middle-class family. His father was a court official. His childhood was comfortable and unremarkable. He was the kind of kid who was supposed to grow up, get a decent job, marry a decent woman, and live a decent life that nobody would ever make a documentary about. The First World War destroyed all of that. He went in as a teenager and came out at 18 with a lieutenant's commission and a head full of experiences that no 18-year-old should have. He tried to go back to normal life after the war. He worked in banking. He worked in advertising. He tried to be the respectable civilian that his background had prepared him to be. It did not work. The Weimar years were brutal for men like him, men with officers' pride and middle-class expectations, and no real place in a world that had stopped making sense. And then in 1931, he found something that gave him a sense of purpose again. He joined the Nazi Party. He joined the SS. And from that moment, everything changed. Here is what Karl Wolff had that most people in the SS did not have. He was charming, genuinely, effortlessly charming, in a way that is rare and that is worth more than almost any other quality in a political organization built around personal loyalty and personal relationships. He was tall, he was handsome, he had an easy smile, and the kind of confident physical presence that makes people instinctively pay attention and instinctively trust. He looked exactly like what the SS wanted to project to the world: strong, capable, reliable, the image of the ideal man that Himmler was obsessed with presenting. Himmler noticed him almost immediately. Within a year of joining the SS, Wolff had become Himmler's personal adjutant, his aide, his gatekeeper, the man who sat outside the Reichsführer's door and decided who got in and who didn't. Think about what that position means for a second. In the entire Third Reich, there was almost no more strategically valuable place to be than right outside Heinrich Himmler's office. And Karl Wolff was 31 years old, and he was already sitting in that chair. What Wolff understood about Himmler, and this is the key to everything, was something that took most people years to figure out. Himmler was one of the most powerful men in Germany, and simultaneously one of the most insecure. Behind all the ideology and the organizational obsession and the cold bureaucratic efficiency was a man who desperately needed to be liked, who struggled with direct confrontation, who found human relationships genuinely difficult and draining. Wolff gave him exactly what he needed. He was the charming face that Himmler could put in front of people when he needed someone to be warm and approachable and socially fluent. He managed the relationships that Himmler found exhausting. He smoothed over tensions before they became problems. He was, in the most practical sense, Himmler's interface with the human world. And in return, Himmler gave him proximity to power, promotion, access, and trust. By 1936, Wolff was an SS-Obergruppenführer, one of the highest ranks in the entire organization, equivalent to a full general, and he was still only 36 years old. He was traveling with Himmler constantly. He was meeting Hitler regularly. He was on first-name terms with Göring, with Ribbentrop, with Speer, with every significant figure in the Nazi leadership. He was at the center of everything. And being at the center of everything meant knowing everything. This is the part of Karl Wolff's story that is impossible to soften or explain away, so there is no point trying. In August 1942, Wolff received a letter from the head of the German railway system. The letter informed him that, following his personal request, a train capacity of 5,000 persons per day had been arranged for the transportation of Jews to the Treblinka extermination camp. Read that again, 5,000 people per day. To Treblinka, Wolff wrote back. He said he was particularly pleased that this arrangement had been made. He said everything was being done to ensure the trains would run smoothly. That letter exists. It survived the war. It was presented at his trial 20 years later. Karl Wolff was not a man who was vaguely aware that bad things were happening somewhere far away. He was a man who requested the trains, received confirmation that the trains were arranged, and expressed joy that the logistics of mass murder were proceeding efficiently. That is who Karl Wolff was. Keep that in mind as the rest of the story unfolds. By 1943, something had shifted. Not morally. There is no evidence that Wolff suddenly developed a conscience about what the SS was doing. What shifted was his calculation about where all of this was going. Stalingrad had happened. 330,000 German soldiers had been surrounded and destroyed. The initiative on the Eastern Front had passed to the Soviet Union permanently. The Americans were in the war, and their factories were producing ships and planes and tanks at rates that Germany could not come close to matching. The strategic bombing campaign was reducing German cities to rubble. Any man with access to accurate information, and Wolff had access to all of it, could see that Germany was not going to win. And any man who understood what was coming after Germany lost, and Wolff understood this perfectly, could see that the people who had run the Third Reich were going to face a reckoning that would not be gentle. He had written enthusiastic letters about train schedules to Treblinka. He had been Himmler's right hand for a decade. He knew what was in the files. He knew what they could prove. He needed a plan. Around the same time, something happened that turned out to be fortunate for Wolff in ways he could not have predicted. He divorced his wife and remarried, which caused a serious falling out with Himmler, who had strong views about the sanctity of SS marriages and was personally offended by the whole situation. The tension between them led to Wolff being moved out of Himmler's immediate circle and sent to Italy as supreme SS and police leader. Effectively, the senior SS commander in the Italian theater, with significant authority over German forces and occupation policies throughout the peninsula. At the time, this probably felt like a demotion. Looking back, it was the luckiest thing that ever happened to him. It put distance between him and Himmler. It gave him operational independence. It put him in a position where he could do something that almost nobody else in the SS hierarchy had the ability to do. He could talk to the other side. The contact came through Swiss intelligence channels and eventually reached a man named Alan Dulles, who was running the Office of Strategic Services in Switzerland, the American intelligence organization that would later become the CIA. Dulles was one of the most sophisticated intelligence operators of the entire war, a man who understood the value of back-channel communications and the importance of exploiting any crack in the enemy's unity. When word reached him that a senior SS general in Italy wanted to discuss the possibility of a separate surrender of German forces in that theater, Dulles was interested. Very interested. The negotiations that followed were conducted in total secrecy, at enormous personal risk, and at a level of complexity that makes them one of the most remarkable episodes of the entire conflict. Wolff was risking his life every time he traveled to Switzerland for meetings with Dulles. If Hitler found out what he was doing, he would be shot immediately. If Himmler found out, the same. He was conducting secret peace negotiations while continuing to serve as a senior SS commander, walking a tightrope over an abyss, and doing it with the same easy confidence that had carried him through everything else. The negotiations nearly collapsed multiple times. The Soviet Union discovered that separate talks were happening and accused the Western Allies of negotiating a separate peace behind their backs, which created a serious diplomatic crisis between Roosevelt and Stalin in the final weeks of the war. The Americans had to repeatedly reassure the Soviets that nothing underhanded was happening, while simultaneously continuing the negotiations that the Soviets were furious about. Dulles was operating without full authorization from Washington for much of the process. The whole thing was improvised, dangerous, and messy in the way that real history always is underneath the clean narrative that gets written afterward. But Wolff kept pushing. He kept showing up to the meetings. He kept working to bring other German commanders in Italy into the process. He was genuinely motivated, at least in part, by a desire to prevent the destruction of northern Italy. The art, the architecture, the infrastructure that Hitler was demanding be demolished as the Allies advanced. And on May 2nd, 1945, 6 days before Germany's formal unconditional surrender, the German forces in Italy laid down their weapons. It was the first major German surrender of the war. It saved lives on both sides. And it was entirely the result of what Karl Wolff had set in motion months earlier at enormous personal risk. Alan Dulles was grateful, and in the world that emerged from the wreckage of the Second World War, Alan Dulles's gratitude was worth an extraordinary amount. When Wolff was taken into Allied custody after the surrender and the question of what to do with him arose, American intelligence intervened. Dulles and the OSS provided assistance that kept Wolff out of the most serious legal proceedings in the immediate post-war period. He testified at Nuremberg as a witness, sitting in the courtroom giving evidence, not sitting in the dock facing judgment. He was held for a period, released, went through a German denazification process, received a 4-year sentence with time served credited, and walked free in 1949. For a man who had been Heinrich Himmler's chief aide for the better part of a decade, who had written letters expressing joy at the logistics of transporting Jews to Treblinka, this outcome was staggering. Operation Sunrise had purchased him a degree of protection that his actual record should never have allowed. He spent the 1950s living quietly in West Germany, apparently believing that the accounting was finished. It was not finished. In 1962, the same year that Adolf Eichmann was tried and executed in Israel, West German prosecutors reopened the case against Karl Wolff. The letter about the Treblinka trains was still there, The evidence of his participation in and knowledge of the SS's criminal activities was extensive and carefully documented. In 1964, he was convicted of being an accessory to the murder of at least 300,000 people. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served less than half of it. He was released in 1969 on grounds of ill health. And Karl Wolff spent the next 15 years as a free man in West Germany, giving interviews, writing his memoirs, presenting himself to anyone who would listen as a soldier who had done what he could to end the war early and save lives through Operation Sunrise. He died on July 17, 1984, in Rosenheim, Bavaria. He was 84 years old. He had outlived almost everyone who had stood beside him at the center of the Third Reich. He had outlived Himmler, who swallowed a cyanide capsule in British custody in 1945. He had outlived the SS generals who were hanged at Nuremberg. He had outlived the organization he served, the ideology he enabled, and most of the legal consequences of what he did while serving it. He died in a bed, in Bavaria, at 84. Now here's the thing about Karl Wolff that you need to sit with for a moment before this video ends. There is a temptation when you tell a story like this to find the redemption in it. Operation Sunrise was real. The surrender was real. The lives it saved were real. Wolff took genuine personal risks to make it happen. That is all true. But the letter about the Treblinka trains is also true. The 300,000 people transported to their deaths with his enthusiastic logistical support are also true. The decade of service to Heinrich Himmler, the proximity to every significant crime the SS ever committed, the knowledge and the participation and the signature on the paperwork, all of it is true at the same time. Karl Wolff was not a good man who made bad decisions in difficult circumstances. He was a man who served a criminal organization at its highest levels for over a decade, who knew exactly what that organization was doing and helped it do those things, and who then made one very smart decision at exactly the right moment that allowed him to walk away from most of the consequences. He picked the right moment to switch sides. He found the right American to be grateful to him. And he lived to 84 while 300,000 people he helped send to Treblinka did not live to see the end of the war. That is the story of Karl Wolff. That is what survival looks like when the system you served collapses around you. And that is why, 40 years after his death, his name still deserves to be remembered. Not celebrated, not forgiven, but remembered. Because forgetting men like Karl Wolff is exactly how men like Karl Wolff happen again.